The history of the Calvinist-Arminian debate, a theological dispute originally amongst Dutch Protestants, dates back to the early 17th century. Its points remain at issue as the basis of current disagreements amongst some Protestants, particularly evangelicals. These debates go back in some form to Augustine of Hippo's battle with the Pelagians in the 5th century on theological cornerstones of soteriology, including depravity, predestination, and atonement. Quinquarticular controversy. The quinquarticular controversy is a term used to refer to the purely theological Calvinist-Arminian clashes of the period 1609 to 1618. A time in which the debate had serious political overtones in the Netherlands. This controversy is the one that was addressed by the Dutch Reformed churches at the Synod of Dort in 1618 to 1619, a meeting to which Protestant representatives from Reformed churches in other countries were invited. Quinquarticular refers to points of contention raised by the Arminian party in its publication of 5 articles of remonstrance in 1610. These were rejected by the Synod in the Canons of Dort, the essence of which is commonly referred to as the 5 points of Calvinism. The controversy marked the transformation of the Arminian movement into a separate, persecuted church organization in the Netherlands. For Arminians it was the start of full persecution after the imposition of an edict, while for Calvinists it resulted in the settling in clear points of doctrine that were initiated by John Calvin and clarified by Theodore Beza. For Lutherans the controversies saw the ending of any possibility of unification with the Calvinists. Theological background. Augustine and Pelagius. Pelagius was a British monk who journeyed to Rome around the year 400 AD, and was appalled at the lax behavior within churches. To combat this lack of holiness, he preached a gospel that began with justification through faith alone but finished through human effort and morality. He had read Augustine's Confessions and believed it to be a fatalistic and pessimistic view of human nature. Pelagius' followers, including Carolestius, went farther than their teacher and removed justification through faith, setting up the morality and works-based salvation now known as Pelagianism. It should be mentioned that the only historical evidence of the teachings of Pelagius or his followers is found through the writings of his 2 strongest opponents, Augustine and Jerome. In response to Pelagius, Augustine adopted a theological system that included not only original sin, but also a form of predestination. Some authors maintain that Augustine taught the doctrines of limited atonement and of irresistible grace, later associated with classic Calvinism. However, others insist that Augustine's writings conflict with these doctrines. Critics maintain that part of Augustine's philosophy might have stemmed from his expertise in Greek philosophy, particularly Platonism and Manichaeism, which maintained a very high view of a man's spirit and very low view of a man's body. Against the Pelagian notion that man can do everything right, he taught that man could do little right. Thus, he reasoned, man cannot even accept the offer of salvation, it must be God who chooses for himself individuals to bring to salvation. A group of Italian bishops, led by Julian, defended the Pelagian view against the Augustinian concept of predestination but was rejected by the Council of Ephesus in 431. Later a monastic movement in southern Gaul also sought to explain predestination in light of God's foreknowledge, but a flurry of writings from Augustine helped maintain the papal authority of his doctrines. Semi-Pelagianism and semi-Augustinianism. After the death of Augustine, a more moderate form of Pelagianism persisted, which claimed that man's faith was an act of free will unassisted by previous internal grace. The Second Council of Orange was convened to address whether this moderate form of semi-Pelagianism could be affirmed, or if the doctrines of Augustine were to be affirmed. The determination of the council could be considered semi-Augustinian. It defined that faith, though a free act, resulted even in its beginnings from the grace of God, enlightening the human mind and enabling belief. However, it also denied strict predestination, stating, "We not only do not believe that any are foreordained to evil by the power of God, but even state with utter abhorrence that if there are those who want to believe so evil a thing, they are anathema." The document received papal sanction. Calvinist reformers used the Council's canons to demonstrate that their formulations of original sin and depravity had already been taught much earlier in the Church. Arminian theologians also refer to the Council of Orange as a historical document that strongly affirms man's depravity and God's prevenient grace, but does not present grace as irresistible or adhere to a strictly Augustinian view of predestination. Middle Ages Augustine's teaching on divine grace was considered a touchstone of orthodoxy within the Western Church throughout the Middle Ages. Nevertheless, within an Augustinian context, theologians continued to debate the precise nature of God and man's participation in salvation, as well as attempting to work out a place for the Church's emerging system of sacraments in the overall scheme of salvation. Thomas Aquinas, the most influential Catholic theologian of the Middle Ages, taught that, from man's fallen state, there were 3 steps to salvation. Infusion of grace. God infuses grace into the human soul. The Christian now has faith and, with it, the ability to do good. This step is entirely God's work and is not done by man, and once a man has faith, he can never entirely lose it. However, faith alone is not enough for salvation. Faith formed by charity, with man's free will restored. Man must now do his best to do good works in order to have a faith formed by charity, and then condign merit. God then judges and awards eternal life on the basis of these good works, which Aquinas called man's condign merit. Aquinas believed that by this system, he had reconciled Ephesians chapter 2 verse 8 and James chapter 2 verse 20 and 2:24, and had provided an exposition of the Bible's teaching on salvation compatible with Augustine's teachings. A second stream of medieval thought, commonly referred to as the Occamists after William of Ockham and also including Duns Scotus and Gabriel Biel, rejected Aquinas' system as destroying man's free will. The Occamists argued that if a man loved God simply because of infused grace, then man did not love God freely. They argued that before a man received an infusion of grace, man must do his best in a state of nature. They argued that just as God awards eternal life on the basis of man's condign merit for doing his best to do good works after receiving faith as a gift from God, so too, the original infusion of grace was given to man on the basis of congruent merit, a reward for man's doing his best in a state of nature. Aquinas followers, commonly referred to as the Thomists, accused the Occamists of Pelagianism for basing the infusion of grace on man's works. The Occamists defended themselves from charges of Pelagianism by arguing that, in the Occamist system, God was not bound to award the infusion of grace on the basis of congruent merit. Rather, God's decision to award the infusion of grace on the basis of congruent merit was an entirely gracious act on God's part. Martin Luther's condemnation of justification by works clearly condemned Occamism. Some proponents of ecumenism argue that the Thomist view of salvation is not opposed to Luther's view of grace, and, since Occamism was rejected as semi-Pelagian by the Catholic Church at the Council of Trent, theology of salvation need not pose a bar to Protestant-Catholic reunion. However, since the Catholic Church's rejection of Jansenism in the Bull Unigenitus, it has been clear that Calvinism could not be accommodated within Catholicism. Arminianism, on the other hand, while it might not square entirely with Catholic theologies of salvation, probably could be accommodated within the Catholic Church, a fact which Arminianism's Protestant opponents have often pointed out. Martin Luther and Erasmus of Rotterdam. Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk in Erfurt, In his disputation against scholastic theology of September 4, 1517, Luther entered into the medieval debate between the Thomists and the Occamists by attacking the Occamist position and arguing that man by nature lacks the ability to do good that the Occamists asserted he had. Modern scholars disagree about whether Luther in fact intended to criticize all scholastics in this disputation or if he was concerned only with the Occamists. Arguing in favor of a broader interpretation is the fact that Luther went on to criticize the use of Aristotle in theology. If this is the case, it is likely that Luther saw Aquinas' Fides Caritate Formata as merely a more cautious form of Pelagianism. Luther continued to defend these views. In 1520, Pope Leo X issued the papal bull Ex Urge Domini, which condemned a position which Luther had maintained at the 1518 Heidelberg Disputation, namely that, after the fall, free will is something in name only, and when it is what is in it, it sins mortally. Luther subsequently defended the proposition in his defense and explanation of all the articles unjustly condemned by the Roman bull of Leo X, in the process stating that free will is really a fiction, with no reality, because it is in no man's power to plan any evil or good, as the article of Wycliffe, condemned at Constance, correctly teaches. Everything takes place by absolute necessity, deciderius. Erasmus of Rotterdam, though first sympathetic to Luther, reacted negatively to what he saw as Luther's determinism. In his De Libero Arbitrio diatribe Sciviculata, Erasmus caricatures the limitations of free will that he saw Luther espousing. Though at times in the diatribe, Erasmus sounded like an Occamist, for the most part he attempted to espouse a middle course between grace and free will, attempting to avoid on the one hand the errors of the Pelagians in the Occamists, and on the other hand, the Manichaean error of Luther and other strict Augustinians. Luther responded with his De Servo Arbitrio, in which he attacked Erasmus vehemently and argued that man was not free to do good. Rather, man's fallen nature is in bondage to sin and to Satan, and man can only do evil. The only way an individual can be saved is if God freely chooses to give that person the gift of faith. Luther's position on the bondage of the will became the position adopted by the Protestant movement.